morning, it's Richard Edelman from New York. I'm joined by Helga Ying in San Francisco and Tonya Reese also in New York. Today, we bring you the Edelmn Trust Barometer special report on climate, our second thereof, just before the Sharm el-Sheikh COP meeting of next week. Just to remind you, in prior reports, we have found 1, a substantial mass class divide in opinion. 2, we have found further that business is the most trusted institution in the world. 3rd, we have found that there is a deep battle for truth, huge problems of disinformation. So again, we go into this study with those assumptions. You'll find some surprising things. So first slide, please. Okay, so look, the situation in the climate is serious. We know that based on present projections, we're not going to make the 1.5 goal. We also know from today's data that the corporate sector is really challenged to meet its objectives at the moment. So next slide, please. Let's just be clear that what we really need is global cooperation. But what we see from our data is, in fact, countries don't trust each other. We need strong leaders, but we don't trust our leaders to do what's right. On information, we can't find the information that actually provokes change. We need individuals to act. What we find in this study is that, in fact, consumers are unwilling to really change. Lastly, it's essential that we have a cultural change. And yet, what we see is concern that, in fact, we'll have a joyless future if we move towards sustainability. That's a construct to consider as we present this data today. Next slide. As the first section, given the events of the last year, floods, tsunamis, hurricanes, climate fears are worsening. Next slide. You see today across the world that people are worried about the effects of climate change, causing natural disasters. It's across gender, it's across income groups, it's across age groups. Again, consistent. Next. 7 in 10 agree. We have to move faster. We need to do more. Again, that's a global finding, increasing. Next. People understand that climate actually could worsen injustice and cause more displacement of people. That, in fact, the poor are going to be more burdened with the suffering, as you saw in Pakistan, for instance, over the summer. Also, that climate change is going to provoke more movement of people from the south to the north. Next. We find significant concerns about institutions. Next. You'll remember that in most of our studies, the most trusted institution is business, not in sustainability. Look at the delta between a national government and business, 22 points. It has flipped the script from our May and January studies about trust in institutions. Government, the most trusted. Stunningly, NGOs, the least trusted on which institution should take the lead. Next. But government has a problem. Politics, not science, is seen as driving climate policy. That's scary. It's also partly a result of what's happened from the pandemic. Expertise has been diminished. Next. Also, it is seen in the democracies that government is unwilling to pass tough laws to force business to change, lacking the will. Next. The slides on business are profound. Again, a 9-point delta between trust in business in general as of May, trusting to do what's right, and on sustainability, 9 points less. Business is third behind NGOs, government, and business. I do want to point out that we do trust NGOs to do what's right, but they're not going to get it done. They lack the ability. Next. 2/3 literally say business is breaking its climate promises. This is really bad, that we're actually either mediocre or worse at keeping our climate commitments. Next. Distrust is undermining global collaboration. Helga, you take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Richard. I'm Helga Ying, Global Chair of Purpose. This year's report findings are important, as staying anywhere close to 1.5 degrees is unachievable without renewed international solidarity. Unfortunately, what we are seeing is growing distrust, which undermines as opposed to strengthens global collaboration. And by its very nature, climate is a global issue that demands global cooperation. Next slide, please. So to set the global scene, we start with a major problem, mutual skepticism. There is worry among the global population that other countries will not deliver on their climate commitments, rendering their own actions meaningless. Globally, 1 in 6 people believe this to be the case. Next slide, please. Very few countries are trusted to do their part. The UK, Germany, and Canada are the only ones trusted. What's interesting is to look to the bottom of the list, China, India, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, because we see that despite being distrusted by their global peers, next slide, they are also the most likely to feel they're already doing their fair share when it comes to addressing climate change. In fact, domestically, most countries feel they're doing their fair share, but others are not, which presents a huge problem in terms of global collaboration and the need for all countries to do more and raise ambitions. Next slide, please. At the same time, a global majority still recognize that developed nations should lead. Interestingly, there's also increasing concern that signing on to global treaties undermines national sovereignty. Both of these sentiments have risen in the past year, and we see that in developing markets especially, the sentiments are much stronger than they are in developed countries. In sum, we are at a standoff. We think we are doing our fair share, and others aren't. We think developed nations should lead, and more of us think international treaties may not be the best way to go, as it undermines national sovereignty. What this tells us is that we are at an inflection point where we decide if we want to be a world that builds more bridges or more walls. Next slide, please. To recap, in the face of the global crisis that climate change presents, we have institutional leaders fumbling, we have a global standoff, and now in this section, we see another barrier. Individuals are on the sidelines. Next slide, please. People broadly acknowledge that in order to really address climate change, business and governments can't do it alone. People have to make dramatic behavior changes as well. Next slide, please. But 85% of people admit that there is a gap between how climate-friendly their lifestyle currently are and how climate-friendly they would like to be. Moving the needle on individual behavior will be a challenge. When asked what they're currently doing to reduce their personal impact on climate change, most people fall somewhere in the bucket of doing nothing or doing the bare minimum, what doesn't cost extra or create inconvenience, and they acknowledge that they are not doing enough. Next slide, please. To add more color to the cost barrier, there's some good and bad news. The good news, 75% of people are willing to consider paying some more. But there's a contingent of people who refuse to pay more for climate-friendly products. 1 in 4 globally fall into this camp. What is particularly interesting is that the strikingly high levels of those not willing to pay more are in the countries that largely can afford to do so, such as France, Canada, Germany, and the US, where people are generally richer. Next slide, please. Which might have something to do with this slide. We see that there is an emotional component to a lack of individual action. 40% feel that if they were to significantly reduce their carbon footprints, they would have to give up the hobbies, interests, and activities that bring them joy. Especially notable is that nearly a half of young adults, ages 18 to 35, agree with this sentiment. If we are to solve for the demand side of the climate equation, we need governments and businesses to work together to create accessible, affordable, and sustainable products and services. But we also need to change the mindset that living a more climate-friendly life can still be enjoyed. Simply put, if about half of young people think living sustainability will mean giving up life's pleasure, then there's a big opportunity for businesses to show the opposite. Showing that sustainability can be joyful could be a great way to engage more people to be part of the solution, especially the younger generation, than leaning into the negative. Back to you, Richard.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, let's get to what we can do. Next slide. For government, I find it fascinating that the first obligation is to balance climate change with the present need for energy. And it's particularly clear for Europe, which has now lowered thermostats, is going to have a cold winter given it's signed off of Russian gas. So again, today and tomorrow have to be considered. Also, government is expected to do positive regulation, perhaps cross-border carbon charges, so that, in fact, where it's produced, where it's consumed, we have a closer connection. Next. For business, the most important job of business is to provide ways that people can get good information. Educate me so that I can act. I don't have quality information at the moment. Give me QR codes. Give me other cues, Forest Stewardship Council kinds of insignias that give me confidence in the lumber. That's the job. Show me how I can be part of the solution. Next. NGOs. NGOs rank, as you'll recall in the first part of the presentation, last as to institution able to actually get things done. Business needs NGOs for the last mile, also for credibility. It would be good if instead of being outside throwing rocks at, it would be inside the tent helping forge a new future. Next. For media. Give me the information I can trust and understand. Specifically, stop just reporting about the problem. We know there are floods. We know there are hurricanes. Give me something about solutions. Further, it's too hard to find trustworthy information. For example, in the last week alone, there was a big piece by Bret Stephens in the New York Times about his trip to Greenland over the summer in which he observed deep environmental degradation, melting of glaciers. Meanwhile, the Wall Street Journal earlier this week basically said doomsday scenarios by the UN are ridiculous. We should just prepare for climate remediation. Irresponsible. We need trustworthy information. Business has to be the center kind of ground for that information, and hopefully the media. Lastly, give me something I can easily understand. Tell me the story in bits that I can share and that, again, are in graphics. Next. Climate spokespeople I can trust. It is a combination of experts and a person like yourself. Who's at the bottom? CEOs. This is a big warning sign for business. Who's just above? Government leaders. Who's just above that? Journalists. So the three usual places for quality information are all put to the side. We need experts. We also need to educate the employees and the communities so that they have enough information to make good decisions. Next. Show the benefits for society and for individuals. To us, it's fascinating that the societal ones rank 10 to 12 points higher than the ones to the individual. This is like a seesaw in the playground. It's got to be kind of up and down. We have to balance the we and the me, the benefits for society and for individuals. Next, overcoming the barriers to climate action. We need to stop just reporting as business, CSR reporting, checking the box on improvements in supply chain. We have to rally society behind this change. We need to show the way. Second, we have to stop nationalism. It cannot be politicized. It cannot be something that politicians say, hey, I can get votes by insisting that ESG standards not be used by money managers. Wrong. Business has to stand up against that. Third, the me and the we. Show the upside for me. We've got to confront this idea of a joyless future. This is dystopian. We're killing ourselves if we can't confront this. This is a communications challenge. The reality is different to the perception. Last, we've got to give information that enables action. Again, if you have such a through the Alice in Wonderland mirror view of the world, people are paralyzed. They're paralyzed by lack of quality information. It is our obligation in the communications business to fill that void, enable people to make the right choices. Now I'm going to turn it over to Ed, my great colleague from EMEA, to run the panel. Thanks, Ed.
Richard, thanks very much. What a fascinating study this year. And to digest it and to discuss it, we have a brilliant panel of experts who, as the data points out, are the most trusted people when it comes to this critical issue of the climate emergency. So we've got the right people. Let me introduce them. So first of all, we've got Bernadette Woods Placky. She's an award-winning meteorologist and director of Climate Central's Climate Matters. It's a program that offers data resources to TV meteorologists and journalists across America to help them tell the most important climate stories to audiences. Now, she spent 10 years working as an on-air meteorologist. She also serves as an expert to media organizations, to NGOs, and academic institutions to help explain the link between the weather we experience and climate change. So a lot of questions, I think, about the communications piece aspect of this puzzle that we're going to discuss with Bernadette. We're also joined by Cassia Moraes, who is the founder of Youth Climate Leaders. There she is. It's an organization that trains and connects young people with networks and opportunities to start careers as climate leaders. She also works at Climate Kick, which is the largest public-private partnership to drive climate innovation in Europe. She's also a member of the LATAM Regional Coordinating Committee for the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. She's a professor of sustainable development policies at the Burgundy School of Business. I'm delighted she's with us today, given just the absolute intensity of all the different roles that she has. Been very interested to hear from her about the role of young people in galvanizing and catalyzing change. I'm also pleased to introduce Professor Tensie Whelan. Tensie is a founding director of, there she is, the NYU Stern Center for Sustainable Business. She's a clinical professor for business and society with 25 years of experience working with businesses to tackle local, national, and international environmental and sustainability issues. Tensie has led, she's had a variety of leadership roles at several international not-for-profits. I'm sure she'll bring into her comments today, and she's served on numerous advisory boards, providing counsel to business on the environmental footprint and sustainability actions that they are required to deliver. And finally, you saw Helga earlier, Helga Ying. She's our global chair of Purpose. There she is in San Francisco. She's more than 25 years of experience in the private and public sector across government affairs, public policy, as well as social impact and sustainability. Lots to pack into 40 minutes. Please also ask questions. If you have them, type them in. I can see them in front of me. But first, to the panel, just give me a macro level. What were you surprised to see in the data? What were you disappointed by? And maybe this is an even harder question. Is there anything in there that you're optimistic about? Who wants to go first? Why don't I go to Bernadette?
Sure. So honestly, I don't know if anything really surprised me. Been tracking these trends for a while, and change takes time, unfortunately, even though we want it to happen immediately when we're trying to save the world. But disappointed that there is not more progress yet. I think that's where I think most of us feel. I'm not going to speak for everyone, but I think a lot of people do feel that. Optimistic, though, because whenever there are challenges, there are opportunities. And Richard did point some of those out already. There are a lot of opportunities here, showing that people want change. People are concerned. And there is a vacuum for someone to step up in that leadership gap. So I think there's a lot of opportunity that we can talk about in this discussion today.
Really interesting. Cassia, do you see it the same way? Is your analysis the same, that actually there are reasons to be optimistic that we see in the data?
Yeah, sure. And maybe if we're going the same direction, I got a bit surprised how the average person ranks high, which is an opportunity for us to support the participation right now at COP27 of young people, of community leaders, people that can talk to a wider audience. I also was a bit disappointed how countries see themselves as doing enough when we see that we are ending our chances of getting 1.5 as the limit for climate change, and optimistic by how can we leverage the ideas of and communicate that solutions are there and people can take action. One particular thing that I call my attention because of my work is how people are already seeing that investing on climate solutions will generate jobs. So I think there is a promising link for us to dive on this and increase acceptance and focus on just transition.
I think, Cassia, that is so interesting, that particularly that first point you make about the perception within countries that they are doing enough and it's for other people. And not only that, the impact potentially then is that they, at a national level, there's a desire to sort of hold back and wait for others to step in. And of course, in that paradigm, nobody does anything. And in the absence of the sort of geopolitical trust building that we need, this is going to be a real problem. Tensie, how do you see the data this year?
Yeah, so first of all, it was fascinating and so important that Edelmn is providing us with this information. I really appreciate it. So a couple things. First of all, everybody's saying, we get the problem, show us the solutions and the hope, right? And what was fascinating to me as well is that they actually diagnosed quite accurately, I think, what the challenges were for all the different major groups, right? So for government, they see that they need stronger government policy to support. They also, for NGOs, recognize that NGOs can actually play a really important role supporting business. For business, they said, you need to give us products and services and information so we can make the right choices. To journalists, they said, and I agree with this, you're telling us all this negative stuff, you're depressing us, you're not giving us a path to feeling hope and solutions. And in terms of the data about the consumer themselves, while there was information of concern, I actually found the fact that 75% said I am willing to pay, and that quite a large percent said I do need to change my behavior. And the fact of the matter is that 75% are willing to pay more than everybody else will have to. But we've also seen this in our research that in fact, consumers really are interested and citizens are interested in solutions. We've just got to give them those solutions and the hope that they can actually make a difference.
I think that is so interesting, Tensie. You're absolutely right. That willingness to pay data point is super interesting. What was it? So I think you said 25% willing to pay more than 10%, a further 25% willing to pay up to 10%. So there is a desire. Challenge, of course, will be, given hyperinflation and the cost of living crisis, to what extent that will then follow through in terms of individual actions. But I think it's really interesting. And I want to come back to your point about government action in a second, but I want to bring Helga in before I do that. Helga, you were involved in constructing this study. As the data came in to Edelmn, what did you see? Were you surprised? You were involved in last year's study as well. Anything that really sticks out to you?
Well, I think I agree with everyone, what they had said, but what jarring to me was that data that I had mentioned, the sizable number of survey participants who actually equate reducing their personal carbon footprint with giving up almost all activities that bring them joy. And I believe that's a huge messaging problem and points to the lack of clarity and information and options that individuals are receiving from institutions, which need to be addressed. And I know that showing that sustainability can be joyful could be a great way to engage more people. And so I'm optimistic about this, to be part of the solution, and that we get governments and businesses to work together to create more accessible, affordable, and sustainable products. I know companies are already doing that. We have companies like IKEA with their, Buy Back Friday initiative, addressing circularity by allowing customers to bring back their furniture to get a discount while giving others an opportunity to buy back, which actually brings joy to customers. Or, Ecoterra's Tazo Regenerative, incorporating sustainability in every aspect of their business and creating this tree core, which addresses an issue of climate justice, where they're teaming up with American Forests to create a tree planting workforce to plant trees in predominantly BIPOC communities where we found temperatures were higher due to the lack of trees. And having this tree core come from these communities, I think this brings joy to everyone and addresses an issue in that community. So I think there are possibilities and ways that businesses and we need governments to find solutions to help bring back joy and know that you can be sustainable and have a joyful life as well.
It's so interesting, Helga, isn't it? Because this is a point that's been repeated so many times, but I think it was the great Sir David Attenborough who said actually one of the principal problems now in terms of tackling the climate emergency is a communications one, and the extent to which this is seen as a sort of zero-sum winners losers is a real problem, and that is obviously a policy problem. It's a communications problem. And one that is we see very much kind of it comes through quite acutely in the data. Look, we've got world leaders flying into Sharm el Sheikh very soon. We're on the eve of the COP27 and the transfer of the presidency from the UK to Egypt. I'm quite interested, Tensie, in the point about government that we've seen here. I mean, the expectation is that government leads, that they step up, that they coordinate together. Yet there is a gap in belief that actually that coordination can lead to the kind of climate actions that we need and progress. How big a problem is this, and how do you think government should think about kind of solving this credibility problem?
Yeah, so first of all, Climate Action Tracker does a really good job looking at the pledges and commitments made by different governments. And they have found, in terms of being aligned with the 1.5 degree goal. And what they found is virtually all are insufficient and most are critically insufficient, including some of the same countries that we saw feel they're doing a good job. And so that's just for pledges. That's not even actually implementing against those pledges. So I think individuals feel quite rightly skeptical about government's ability to move. On the other hand, we have seen what happened during the pandemic, where while we had some real issues around the world, we also saw rapid mobilization of resources, public policy, and support by government. We have seen that happening as well right now in Europe, where, of course, they're juggling short-term concerns around energy, but also being forced to make what I think will be ultimately very important decarbonization investments. And so nothing like a crisis to focus the mind. However, we can't really afford the kind of crisis we might have with a 2-degree plus world. And then the final thing that I would say is, we saw in last year's COP some really good progress made. For example, commitments by countries around creating an international marketplace with rules around carbon offsets, so there wouldn't be cheating or double counting, and so that there could be a fund created to support developing countries with their resiliency. So we know that governments can get together and act, and this is a very important opportunity for accountability and forward movement. But quite a lot of reason for individual skepticism.
And Tensie, just a quick follow-up. Do you see a future in which actually there's competition in the other direction, that there's actually competition to decarbonize at a national level, because there is a real sense that actually there's competitive advantage in doing so. So rather than a kind of, lowest common denominator situation, we see actually nations trying to compete with each other because they see real economic advantage in doing so.
Yes, and I think, for example, in the U.S., the Inflation Reduction Act is a brilliant act that is going to help the United States really be able to invest and develop more and stimulate actually private sector investment around decarbonization technologies and approaches. I think we've seen Germany actually invest quite a lot there. We've seen China be a leader around solar and that create real competitive advantage for them. And we're seeing as well, many emerging economies see the opportunities here from a business perspective. So I do think that there's huge innovation, competitive advantage. When we talk about decarbonization, we're talking about changing everything, changing technologies, changing jobs, changing the way we lead our lives, which could be done in a very exciting and innovative and fun way, right? And so I think governments do have an opportunity to shine here. And in fact, we actually see a lot of local governments really doing a lot more than national governments often. So in New York City, for example, we have a lot of stimulation of investment in decarbonization. We have a Climate Mobilization Act to tackling the building footprint, et cetera. So there is a lot of hope and opportunity.
So I want to come to the rather depressing and dismal picture for business in a second. But before I do that, just on this topic of government leadership, Cassia, to what extent do you think public pressure, activist pressure, is going to improve the picture in terms of government delivery? I was at the COP meeting last year and was very struck by the cut through that Indigenous voices had, that activists had, in terms of, in a very powerful way, shaping the agenda. Do you see that continuing through this COP27 process? What role for people power in all of this?
Yeah, I feel like when we talk about leadership, we also need to consider investing in the leadership of other people beyond business leaders and governments, as you mentioned, activists, community leaders, indigenous populations, because they can pressure for climate action, they can hold their policymakers accountable, they can vote differently. We saw in several governments change in leadership that might make climate action easier for those governments and for the international community. But I feel oftentimes like they are consulted, but they are not invited to develop solutions in partnership with these leaders in business and in government. So I think there's a missing opportunity that we can also get together to develop these solutions. And I also feel that people, when they see these activists or people like them talking about these topics, they might be more open to consider. So we also can do this together, but it goes beyond, and we can talk this later when we talk about the individual responsibility, because at some point people can do as much individually, and we need to change systems. And governments might feel threatened. They feel in this gaming theory mindset that they might be in a prisoner's dilemma, but at the end of the day, we are in a commons aversion dilemma, whereas if we don't cooperate, we might face catastrophe. And I feel a key international policy consideration is that even if the relative gains and risks for climate change are not equal, we need to advance. And I feel this is one of the things that we cannot sometimes go beyond, because countries might feel that other ones will be disproportionately benefited if they make changes. But at the end of the day, we all will be impacted somehow. So I feel like one of the classes that I gave recently, we discussed the climate clubs. There is a proposal of Professor Nordhaus. So how can we do this race to the top and find other ways and policies as well?
Cassia, just a quick follow-up. What has to change to get these voices, these perspectives in the policy-making room, in the decision-making room?
Well, there are many challenges and also solutions. For example, in Brazil, we have an organization called Vetor Brazil, other Legisla Brazil, that they develop talent and put them to work with government. So they increase the technical capacity. We can also have more participative councils where people can work together, can invite these leaders to hear from them. And at the end of the day is also about hiring with more diversity, like how many city levels have indigenous employees, like, because sometimes we, and also in the companies, we've seen the diversity topic increasing, because at the end of the day, we need to have this expertise and diverse backgrounds in-house to be able to develop more. And finally, for young people, give them opportunities, like there are huge levels of youth unemployment. So apprenticeships and paid internships are good ways to bring new perspectives and help young people to start their careers.
Thank you. Can I just turn to this sort of big topic around the expectations and the sort of slightly, dismal expectation that people have of business leading the change when it comes to what, I think we all believe now is the biggest existential crisis that we face on this planet. I mean, we have seen almost a double-digit decline in those who believe business can be trusted to do what is right on climate. I mean, that is pretty staggering. And you heard from Helga earlier about some of the really, I think, dynamic and inspiring projects that some companies like IKEA, as she mentioned, are really undertaking, but that's clearly not cutting through. I mean, Bernadette, you spend a lot of time talking to the private sector, talking to business about how they communicate on this topic. What do you think is going wrong?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I do think change is happening. It's just not happening fast enough. That's right. The real challenge here. Two things can happen at once. We're making advances and solutions are happening, but the speed of our warming is so much faster and we've waited so long to finally tackle this subject. So that's what we're seeing here, is this sort of cautious approach in the beginning when people really needed to take it on. So that's why we're dealing with bigger challenges now, because we waited too long. But given that, now that we're at this point, there's still a little bit of a caution to people's approach versus jumping right in and leading. And I think there's a lot of ways that people can take this on. First of all, it's clear the public wants to move forward on this subject. I mean, that is taken care of. So now people have to help them move forward. We can make it easier, as people have already talked about here. We can make it cheaper. We can even make it fun. And we can help them shift the narrative and change it and envision this future where driving an electrical vehicle is really fun. It's a lot more fun. Electric buses are cleaner for our kids to breathe air. I mean, the kinds of things that we can do to help drive this forward are not just do it in our business model, but bring it forward in a public education campaign, because there is still a gap to the public in understanding what the changes that we need to do are. And since solutions are advancing so rapidly right now, it's hard to keep up with them. So this is where businesses can help the public understand. And what I mean by that gap of education is, if you're a coffee company, put information on your coffee cup. If you're a sports organization, have a big public campaign climate day. If you're an EV pickup, go to the Big 10 tailgates and do a tailgate tour. I mean, there's ways to really connect with the public so they can understand and see the fun and see how they can be part of the solution moving forward.
There's a really interesting point that you make, Bernadette, which is essentially for the mainstream audiences, essentially elevating the narrative from one that is potentially quite, is quite depressing. And I think in we see it in the data, I think creates the impression in people's minds that, the game is already lost. And actually what you're talking about is applying creativity, creating energy and vibrancy into campaigns that actually give people a sense of what they need to do. And I think it's interesting in the data, actually. I mean, Richard talked about this, that people struggle to find the right information, credible information, trusted information, but they also then, when they find information, they actually struggle to understand it and make it meaningful at an individual level. Yet, as you say, the public want to do more. People want to do more. I mean, it's particularly true, and I'm going to come back to this if we have time at the end in the results in China, which are really fascinating. But Helga, you spend a lot of your time as the global leader of our purpose practice talking to companies about this issue, talking to clients about how they elevate their climate communications. Just give me a sense of, firstly, why do you think the data shows what it shows, which is a lack of trust? And then second, what advice are you giving companies?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the role communications plays in informing the public and tackling climate change, it just cannot be overstated. I mean, all institutions have a role to play in providing this important information, and that's what's lacking and each has a responsibility to provide the solutions needed to combat the worst effects of climate change. But we also need to provide information that people can trust and understand easily and accessible. And business should provide not only education and services that help consumers make smart, sustainable decisions, but also provide these products and services that make those choices easier. We know that from our report that we see there is a 5.6% increase in trust for business when they support their stakeholders in taking action. And this includes providing clear information and education on how to reduce their own climate impact. And then when they adopt, for example, science-based targets, there'll be a 4.5 increase in trust. And then if businesses support their suppliers in reducing their climate impact, it becomes a 4.3%. And then, as I'm saying, to develop, friendly products and technology, a 4.1% increase in trust. So there's a lot of opportunity for businesses, not just to educate, but to also take action and find solutions.
And I wonder, Helga, whether there's a lag here. I was on a public panel discussing this issue with Alok Sharma just before the summer, and he was really struck actually by the level of private sector involvement in COP26, and actually the short-term programs and commitments that were being communicated at Glasgow. So I just do wonder whether there is a slight lag effect, but look, we will see over time. We've been talking, and actually Bernadette introduced this point around how do you catalyze individual action at a societal level. And what's interesting in the data is there's clearly a very, very strong majority awareness that actually individuals can take actions that will have an effect. And the IPCC most recent report, I think, talked about the demand side. And in 12 of the 14 countries we studied, the proportion of people who now believe dramatic behavior change is required has increased. Yet 2/3 are saying they're doing very little themselves. I just wonder the kind of psychology that's going on here. Tensie, I wonder if I can ask you about this. Why do you think that kind of say-do gap still exists? What's going on in the psychology of society?
Well, first of all, I don't think the gap is as bad as we think it is. So we done a research where we look at actual consumer purchasing of consumer packaged goods in the United States, looking at everything, hundreds of thousands of products that are bought in mom and pop shops to Target and Amazon. And what we see is that sustainability marketed products are growing 3 times faster than conventionally marketed products at an average 28% premium. We saw in 2021, $3.4 billion of carbon labeled product sold, up from $1.3 billion the year before, up from 0 the year before. so clear. And actually quite fascinatingly, we see this across different demographics. The more accessible it becomes, even with a premium, the more you see it across rural and urban, across educated and not educated, across high income and low income, right? So, again, it's availability more than it seems to be premium, although clearly we need to make sure that premiums don't get in the way of really scaling up investment here. So I think consumers are showing and demonstrating that they care about this. I'll just give another sort of example of the types of things that corporates can do to engage individuals. So if you think about tea, a cup of tea, the bulk of the carbon footprint is in you and me boiling an entire kettle of water for our cup of tea, as opposed to the actual amount of water we need, right? That's a very easy, fix. And so we saw Unilever with their tea brands actually go out there and in fun interview, sort of fun communications, provide people with that information. Similarly, they ran a fun advertisement about showering with a friend in order to save water and energy, sort of tongue in cheek, but nevertheless getting the point across. So I think that there's real opportunity to engage consumers. And I would say the one other thing I would just add, just having a conversation with my undergraduate students about this yesterday, they're really interested in sharing models around clothing, around cars, around other things, and see this as a fun activity to go out and find, like the joy of the hunt, right? Finding used product that they like and want to use and then share out again.
Are you worried though, Tensie? I think the data, by the way, is stunningly interesting in terms of the actual actions that people are taking. I just wonder, are you concerned though, given the kind of the fallout from the invasion of Ukraine, shrinking discretionary spend, hyperinflation? I think the Bank of England in the UK today said the UK is going to is in a recession that's going to be the longest in a century, shallower than the 2008, but nevertheless, it will have a huge impact on the disposable income that people have to spend on products and services. Are you worried that that is going to, in some way, kind of be a brake on what you see in the data?
Yes, but. So the first point is climate change, if not tackled, is going to increase the cost of everything for all of us, right? So the cost of not doing it is going to be far more for you and me as individuals. And that's a point that both government and business and NGOs need to get across. Secondly, what we're beginning to see in terms of sales of sustainable products is that the larger legacy brands are now coming in with new products at a much lower price point, more at price parity with conventional. So I think we'll see more of that, which will then enable people to purchase the products without that heavy premium that we've seen to date. And then finally, I think that what we're seeing is that as companies tackle climate, they unlock operational efficiencies and risk reduction and other benefits that can actually help them reduce costs for the consumer ultimately. So I think there's a lot of trends, if well managed, can help us surmount what I agree is a real challenge.
So really good questions come in, actually. Maybe I can ask you, Bernadette. And the question is, do you have any suggestions on how to make information more digestible and relatable for the common person and to ensure appropriate context, given this is a complex matter? So how do you communicate in simple form to somebody that is time poor in a supermarket or in a shop buying a product?
I have lots of ideas. We could go on for hours on this one, but I'll try to be succinct because this is really what I do. First of all, it's know your audience. It is the golden rule of communication, and it is so often overlooked. You want to meet people where they are and connect on those shared values. There are more things that bring us together than disconnect us. So knowing your audience, it means who exactly is that person in the tone, the topic, the timing? What are their interests? How do you deliver this? How do you connect with what's going on in their world? So that's the absolute golden rule. The second, I would say, in meeting your audience is it's great that we're learning all this terminology and coming up to speed, but not everyone is. And honestly, not everyone cares. So you want to keep simplifying. And I get really frustrated when people say dumbing it down, because it's not. It takes a ton of skill to break down complex subjects into simple words. So know your audience, simplify, just drop that jargon. Don't go there. It's like you're talking to your grandma, right? So my grandma's not a PhD scientist any sort here. Maybe yours is, but you want to connect with her. So you want to simplify things to connect with her. The third, I'd say, is tell stories. We know that stories open minds. They take people on journeys, bring those people and faces into the story to humanize things. And the fourth is don't overthink it. People have become so scared of this subject that they've run away from it and have been so cautious. And that's why we're playing catch up right now. Science is on your side. The public wants action. So don't overthink this. Go catch it. So those are the four main pieces, I'd say, to really break things down for people.
That's fabulously clear, brilliantly communicated, Bernadette. Thank you. Can I talk about one of those audiences in terms of that point about know your audience, which is younger people, Generation Z, and millennials as well. Particularly in that group, there's a sort of trade-off that they see. Richard talked about this, that the kind of zero sum, the world will be joyless if we make these changes. And that is particularly true in younger people. I wonder, Cassia, when you talk to youth activists, do they recognize that problem and that tension? And how do you think we can overcome it with younger audiences?
Yeah, one of the main motivations to found Youth Climate Leaders was to connect young people with opportunities to take action, because after decades of raising awareness, if they just know what is happening, as we are seeing with increasing levels of climate anxiety or like climate grief, as some people are calling. This knowledge without action leads to anger, to fear, to anxiety. So I think that's an important point. It's not that young people are not informed. Sometimes they are too informed, but with a very little way to act. And in addition to the reliable information about the climate impacts, people, not only young people, but I work directly with them, they want to have access to information on how can they act right now. So where are the successful projects that they can support, donate for, perhaps try to work at or replicate. I think that would be very useful, because oftentimes you are just overwhelmed and don't know where to start. So this is, I think, something that is missing. And when we developed the last year a pilot proposal called Capacita Clima, like Climate Careers Bootcamp, to focus on climate jobs, I remember that we made a video using a music that is very famous in Brazil, so people could connect. And I showed that video to the nurse that was taking care of my mom. And she cried seeing the video. She has never discussed climate change, but she understood the need for better jobs after the pandemic. She started saying that her son was not working. She was worried about his future. So we have to find stories that connect with people right now with their problems, and then show how climate action can help to tackle them.
It's so interesting, Cassia, isn't it? Because trying to get the balance right between a sense of optimism that you can take action and things will change, but also realism about what's going on. I mean, Richard mentioned the Bret Stephens piece earlier this week about Greenland. So finding that right balance is really critical. We actually only have a few minutes left, but before we end, I did want to forgive me, because I know the panel are not specifically experts on China, but I was very struck by the China findings. There's a much greater level of worry and concern about climate change in China than any of the other countries that we see in the study. And there's a greater sense individual action is required there than elsewhere as well. Plus a frustration that action is just happening too slow. I just wonder, Tensie, is there any thinking that you have? What's your analysis of what's happening in China? Because the numbers have changed significantly year on year.
Yeah, and with a caveat, as you said, I am not a China expert. So if I were to have a conjecture, it might be that, first of all, they've been suffering from a systemic, really an ongoing challenge around COVID. So they've recognized how something like climate change in the form of COVID has completely disrupted their lives in a really negative way. At the same time, they have begun to experience and to recognize as such climate events that have had negative impacts on many people's lives. So I think that those two trends have caused a more of a focus on individual action. At the same time, I think we saw in the results that everybody in China feels China's doing enough as a government, whereas they didn't feel that way about other countries. But we all know that China actually needs to do a lot more. So there is still a real disconnect there, and I think a lot of that comes down to government policy and how they communicate with the citizens.
And do you think, Cassia, because I think there's almost 500 million Chinese citizens who are under the age of 25. Do you think this is the start of a possible sort of societal awakening in China that could potentially have profoundly positive consequences in terms of moving the climate needle, if you like?
Yes, and I feel like even though the differences between ages are not that abrupt in the report, I feel how the ages feel this climate threat is very different, because for someone that is 80, 60 now, we are talking about impacts, of course, they're going to feel, but like for someone that is 12, is their whole lives being impacted. I know a lot of young people, they are rethinking having children, like because of this. So I think that how this impacts our lives and the younger people's lives is stronger, and having so many young people there, and also perhaps trying to find solutions. But at the same time, we see that as a country, they oftentimes feel that they are doing more, or like they are doing enough. So sometimes this blaming policy might not lead to cooperation. So how can we tap into the need of individual recognition for change and transform this into a country policy? I think this is a challenge for many countries, not only China.
Super interesting. Now, we've actually only got a minute left. So a quick question that I'd like everyone to answer. What is the one thing that you think business can and should do in terms of addressing these perception challenges it has in respect to climate action? What do you want business to do? One thing, and I'm going to go to Bernadette first.
Can I make it two?
Go on, why not?
Use your platform to educate. It's not just about your internal changes. That is really important, but also educate. The other thing too is the youth, they're not just your consumers, they're your future workforce. And we're about to see an massive transformation in the next 5 to 10 years of people bringing so many different skill sets, and they're going to demand this. So there's an opportunity. Change the narrative. You have an opportunity to do that.
Change the narrative. Helga, what's your one or two?
I want to say action gains trust, and we need action and solutions. But also, as Richard just noted this morning in his blog, we need to do a better job communicating, moving from reporting about climate change to rallying support for accelerated action.
Fantastic. Subtle promotion for Richard's blog there. It is a must read. Cassia.
Well, I think two things. First, we saw in the report that investing in educating people is well seen for business. So supporting more initiatives such as youth climate leaders and many more that are educating people, because this is going to pay off, as was said, like in the future workforce, but it's the right thing to do. And this includes your staff. And also, finally, focusing on your impact, right? And finding solutions and liaising with academia, with innovators to change what you are doing. Not only of course, the community behind, but also changing right now the main drivers of your impact should be your obsession.
This is very, very valuable advice there. And Tensie, take us home.
Work with NGOs who will give you credibility to lobby government to put in place much more helpful and stringent public policy, and work with NGOs as well to communicate with the media and with citizens about the options, actions, and solutions and how that can bring you joy.
Tensie, thank you so much. The time has absolutely flown by over the last 40 minutes. I'm grateful to all of you for your contributions, the thoughts, the time that you've spent looking at the data in advance and sharing it with those on the line today. Very, very powerful observations and advice, I think, for everybody. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Richard Edelman for some closing remarks. Richard.
So I think what you heard today in the data is a really important moment, which is we have to move from reporting, which we have taken on as business, CSR reports, ESG data, all good. We have to go to 2.0, which is we've got to rally the stakeholders. We need to educate the consumers and unleash the demand side, not just the changing of the supply side. We've also got to educate the employees. You'll note that the second most important source of information is a person like yourself. It's not just experts, it's also the horizontal communication that happens peer-to-peer. Lastly, we've got to get people positive about this move towards a climate responsibility. It can't be joyless. It has to be about me and not just we, individual as well as societal. These are all communications challenges. Edelmn is 100% in on doing this. We have mandatory climate education program that we're doing with Columbia University across all our 6,000 employees. We're completely committed on SBTI goals so that we're walking our own talk. Thanks to my brother. Thank you, John. And lastly, just to say, we want to be partners with all corporations that want to meet the Paris goals, 2040 standard, and we're convinced that we have an essential role to play in this transformation as the leading communications firm. So thanks to all our clients. Thanks deeply to Ed, to the panelists, to Tonya Reese and Dave Bursaw for doing the research. And we'll see you all in January for the Edelman Trust Barometer for Davos.